Hello everyone, welcome to SJ's classes. It's been a while since we started discussing art in general, movements that are connected to art, which influenced and inspired art, and also some of the renowned artists. How can we not talk about someone who is regarded as the most influential artist of the 20th and 21st centuries? I'm talking about none other than the Spanish painter Pablo Picasso. This video lesson will introduce you to this Spanish painter and also will give you a detailed analysis of his most popular painting Guernica, as he is associated with two important cultural, artistic and literary movements which are Cubism and Surrealism. I will also elaborate on these two movements as part of this video lesson. Once again, welcome to SJ's classes. Let's begin with an introduction to this painter. Pablo Picasso was a Spanish painter, sculptor, printmaker, ceramicist, and theater designer. The only noun perhaps you are not familiar of in this list is ceramicist. A ceramicist is a craftsman who shapes pottery on a potter's wheel and bakes them in a kiln. A kiln is a furnace or firing or burning or for used for drying things such as porcelain or bricks. So he was a painter, sculptor, printmaker, ceramicist, and theater designer. One of the most interesting aspects that I found about him is his full name. His full name is Pablo Diego Jose Francisco de Paula Juan Nepomuceno Maria de los Remedios Cipriano de la Santísima Trinidad Ruiz y Picasso. Quite a lengthy name, isn't it? Now, this was done in the traditional Andalusian custom of honoring several saints and relatives. This is a custom that was practiced in his land. That is why he has a lengthy name. He was born on October 25th, 1881 in Spain, and he died on April 8, 1973 at France. Throughout the long course of his career, he created more than 20,000 paintings, drawings, sculptures, ceramics, and other items such as costumes and theater sets. He impressed his family and the world with his paintings from an early age. At the age of 14, he painted Portrait of Aunt Pepper. You can see the painting on the screen, which is a striking depiction that has been referred to as one of the best portraits in Spanish history. And at the age of 16, Picasso created his award winning painting, Science and Charity. You can also see that painting on the screen. Art critics and historians typically break Picasso's adult career into distinct periods, the first of which lasted from 1901 to 1904 and is called his Blue Period, after the color that dominated nearly all of his paintings over these years. Deeply depressed over the death of his close friend Carlos Casagemas, he painted scenes of poverty, isolation, and anguish, almost exclusively in shades of blue and green. His most famous paintings from the Blue Period include Blue Nude, La Vie, which means life, and The Old Guitarist, all the three of which were completed in 1903. All these paintings were completed in 1903. By 1905, Picasso had largely overcome the depression that had previously debilitated or weakened him, and the artistic manifestation of Picasso's improved spirits was introduction of warmer colors, including beiges, pinks, and reds. Beige is a very light brown color for your information. And this particular period is known as his Rose period, and this extended from 1904 to 1906. Some of his most famous paintings from these years include Family at Saltimbanks, which was made in 1905, Gertrude Stein, and two nudes. Then comes the paintings associated with the movement called Cubism. Now, this is the space in which I will talk about the movement called Cubism. Cubism was an artistic style pioneered by Picasso and his friend and fellow painter Georges Braque. Basically, Cubism is a style of painting in which the subject matter is presented as geometric forms such as triangles, circles, and cubes. The artists who were part of this movement depicted the subject from a multitude of viewpoints to represent the subject in a greater context. The point was not to show reality in the usual way, but to explore a more fully realized reality through abstraction. This movement was also a break from the long standing tendency in art to attempt to create the illusion of a real three dimensional space from a fixed viewpoint on the two dimensional canvas. Cubist artists and Cubism art emphasize the two dimensional nature of the canvas instead of creating the illusion of depth. So, this movement was also a reaction against the kind of practices that existed in the field of painting earlier. Picasso's Cubist period extends from 1906 to 1918. His early Cubist painting, known as his analytic Cubist works, include Three Women, Bread and Fruit Dish on a Table, and Girl with Mandolin. His later Cubist works are distinguished as synthetic Cubism for moving even further away from artistic typicalities of the time, creating vast collages out of a great number of tiny individual fragments. These paintings include Still Life with Chair Caning, Card Player, and Three Musicians. Now, since I talked about analytical and synthetic cubism, let me also elaborate on these two terms. These two cubism are two distinct phases through which the movement called cubism developed. The former, which is analytic cubism, it ran from 1908 to 1912, and the artworks which were part of it were made up of an interweaving of planes and lines in muted tones of blacks, greys, and ochres. So, the kind of colors that dominate during that period of Cubism are blacks, greys, and ochres. And the shapes that the artists used were planes and lines, and interweaving of planes and lines. The latter, which is termed as synthetic cubism, is generally considered to date from about 1912 to 1914 and is characterized by simpler shapes and brighter colors. So, we talked about Picasso's blue period, his rose period, and also the cubist period. Now, let's move into the next period, which is termed as the classical period. And this extends between 1918 and 1927. And in this period, he marks a brief return to realism in a career otherwise dominated by experimentation. The outbreak of World War I ushered in this great change in Picasso's art, this shift from experimentation to realism, portrayal of realism or the reality around you. His most interesting and important works from this period include Three Women at the Spring, Two Women Running on the Beach, The Race, and The Pipes of Pan. From 1927 onward, Picasso became caught up in a new philosophical and cultural movement known as Surrealism. So earlier I talked about Cubism, now it's about Surrealism that I'm going to talk about. So from 1927 onward, Picasso became caught up in a new philosophical and cultural movement known as Surrealism, the artistic manifestation of which was a product of his own Cubism and another movement called Dadaism. It is believed that the movement began with the poet André Breton in Paris in 1924, and it was both an artistic and literary movement. Let me remind you, I'm talking about the movement called Surrealism. So it began with André Breton in 1924, and it was an artistic and literary movement. Surrealist art is often dreamlike and sometimes bizarre. Bizarre means strange. That's because surrealist artists want to use art to show the inner workings of the mind, especially in regards to areas of sexuality or violence, which they consider to be frequently oppressed. The work of Sigmund Freud, particularly his book The Interpretation of Dreams that came out in 1899, was profoundly influential for surrealists. A fundamental aspect of surrealist movement is a mode of expression called automatism, which involves the act of automatic or uncensored recording of the thoughts and images that emerge into an artist's mind. Something like the stream of consciousness technique, in which you trace the character's thought processes. Another feature of this movement, called surrealism, was that it tried to balance between the rational vision of life with the power of the unconscious and dreams. So the surrealist artists, they try to inject or incorporate unconscious ideas, aspects related to dream into your everyday life, into the rational vision of life. So they try to balance both these aspects. This was done as a reaction against rationalism and literal realism that dominated the earlier period. So these are the two movements which are closely associated with this painting. Picasso is also credited with inventing constructed sculpture and co-inventing the collage art style, something which is very much popular today. So he co-founded this particular art style. He is also regarded as one of the three artists in the 20th century credited with defining the elements of plastic arts. This revolutionary art form led society towards societal advances in painting, sculpture, printmaking, and ceramics by physically manipulating materials that had not previously been carved or shaped. So it was plastic that was being carved or shaped, and this was not done earlier. These materials were not just plastic, they were things that could be molded in some way, usually into three dimensions. Artists used clay, plaster, precious metals, and wood to create revolutionary sculptural artwork the world had never seen before. Picasso died in 1973, leaving an artistic legacy that continues to resonate today throughout the world. So that is all regarding Pablo Picasso. Now let's move on to an analysis of the painting titled Guernica. Guernica is a 1937 oil painting on canvas, which is regarded as the most touching and anti-war painting in history. They said that this painting was an immediate reaction to the Nazis' devastating casual bombing practice on the Basque town, which is located in the border between France and Spain, Basque town of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War. It should also be noted that Picasso was actually commissioned by the newly elected Spanish government to paint an artwork for the Spanish pavilion at the 1937 Paris World's Fair, and it is for this purpose that he made the painting, though the catalyst was the German bombing of the town of Guernica. Let me also tell you something about this war. In 1936, a civil war began in Spain between the Democratic Republic government and fascist forces led by General Francisco Franco, who was attempting to overthrow the government. Picasso's painting is based on the events of April 27, 1937, when Hitler's powerful German Air Force, acting in support of Francisco Franco, bombed the village of Guernica in northern Spain. We understand the intensity of the bombing when we come across the fact that the bombing happened for more than 3 hours and 25 bombers dropped 100,000 pounds of explosives on the village, reducing it to rubble and affecting almost one third of the population. As the painting reflected some of the horrors associated with war, it has come down in history as a monumental artifact that acts as a reminder of the tragedies of war and also acts as an anti war symbol and an embodiment of peace. The painting is 3.5 meters, which is almost 11 feet tall, and 7.8 meters, which means it is almost 25.6 feet wide. It's pretty enormous when compared to the paintings that we discussed earlier. Picasso painted it in a monochromatic scheme using gray, black, and white. The picture is full of symbols, and its overall theme is one of suffering. It portrays a frenzied tangle of six human figures, which include four women, a man, and a child, and a horse and a bull. These nightmarish figures and dismembered bodies in the painting can be seen as the influence of the movement called surrealism. Let's look at the finer details of the painting. On the far left of the painting, you see a woman with her head held back and screaming in pain and grief. She holds the lifeless body of her dead child. This is perhaps one of the most devastating and unforgettable images in the painting. To her right is the head and partial body of a large white bull, which is perhaps the only unharmed and calm figure amidst the chaos represented in the painting. The bull could either be symbolic of the Spanish tradition which encouraged bullfighting, or the indifferent expression on its face makes art critics interpret it as General Francisco Franco, under whose leadership the bombing happened. There is also a dove that you see behind the bull, which is as if almost erased out of the painting. This erasure is symbolic of the peace that disappeared in Guernica during the war. As you're aware of, doves are mostly associated with peace, and therefore this dove, which has been almost erased out of the painting, which has almost faded out, it's symbolic of the peace that faded out in the land during the war. Beneath these figures, you see a dead or wounded man with a severed arm, and his mutilated hand clutches a broken sword. It is only his heads and arms that we see in the painting. The rest of his body seems to be covered by scattered parts of other figures in the painting. You also see a ghostly flower that grows by the fighter's hand, which should signify the hope despite the bloodshed that happened. In the center of the painting stands a terrified horse with mouth open and seems to be screaming in pain, probably as its side is pierced by something like a spear. The man with the severed arm must be the fallen rider of the horse. The light bulb above the horse could be Picasso's way of representing the bombing. Picasso did not illustrate the bombing in a realistic manner, and there aren't any bombs depicted in the painting. Instead, he uses a light bulb surrounded by a glowing halo of the luminous spikes. This should symbolize the flames that tore apart the sky during the bombing. Since the light is shaped like an eye and is positioned at the top of the painting, art historians have also tried to equate it with the God's eye as he overlooks the madness and destruction caused by the war. On the right of the painting, you find three more women. One rushes in, looking up at the stark light bulb at the top of the scene. Another, almost a ghostly figure, leans out of the window of a burning house, her long extended arm holding a gas light, while the third woman appears trapped in the burning building, screaming in fear and horror. You see that all their faces are distorted in agony. Their eyes are dislocated, mouths are open, and tongues are shaped like daggers. It is their desperation that is probably conveyed through these abstract representations. So these are some of the characters and things that you note when you come across this painting for the first time. This painting is now considered as a marker of humanity, a timeless piece whose frightening message is still understood by people all over the world, regardless of national, geographical, or religious factors. So that is all regarding Guernica and Pablo Picasso. I hope you liked the video. If you did like it, please share this video to others. Thank you so much for being with me. I will see you in another video lesson.